Prime Minister Winston Churchill galvanized British courage with his words.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
The public took shelter below city streets and London subway stations, creating a subterranean world of survival. They kept their spirits up in a variety of ways. During the summer of 1940, the Italians launched an offensive campaign from Libya into Egypt. They were soon turned back by British troops, so Hitler sent General Erwin Rommel and his Africa Corps to begin a new offensive in North Africa. Where Italy had failed, Rommel would succeed magnificently and become known to the world as the Desert Fox. In the United States, isolationism continued to be popular among Americans. They simply wanted nothing to do with the devastating wars in Europe and Asia. Some prominent U.S. senators formed an America First committee, along with other notables such as aviator Charles Lindbergh and Chicago Tribune publisher Robert McCormick. They preached neutrality, regardless of how hard-pressed the British might become in their struggle against fascism. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to help Great Britain and formalized his commitment by signing the Atlantic Charter with Winston Churchill. FDR managed to send 50 surplus U.S. destroyers to England for use against German U-boats. He also sent U.S. troops to occupy Greenland and kept it out of German hands. One bright spot for the Allies occurred in May 1941 when the powerful German battleship Bismarck, the pride of Hitler's navy, was hunted down in the Atlantic and sunk with most of its crew. The Royal Navy got revenge for the loss of its own battleship, HMS Hood, which had fallen victim to the Bismarck's guns. 1941 was mostly a victorious year for the Germans. They captured the island of Crete with a spectacular airborne assault. They invaded Greece and Yugoslavia, and the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, pushed the British out of Libya. Hitler and his generals turned their attention toward the Soviet Union. They secured the support of conservative monarchs in Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, and secretly planned for a massive invasion of the communist nation. In the summer of 1941, despite the non-aggression pact he had signed with Joseph Stalin, Hitler ordered his generals to invade the Soviet Union.
The war in the East was the real war for Hitler and for the German armed forces. Certainly they expended more effort, energy, men, material, and planning in the East than in any other theater of the war, any other front. It was a war in which Germany was to achieve living space, vast areas of colonization. The initial plan for Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the German invasion of Russia of June 1941, called for the German forces to move up to an operational line between Archangel in the north and Astrakhan in the south. If one looks at a map, one would realize that that was an enormously ambitious objective, a huge amount of territory being taken. This was a war which is to be fought without mercy. Hitler made that clear to his generals. The generals made it clear to their troops. This is not a conventional war. This is a war for the racial supremacy of the German people and for the subjugation of the Slav permanently. So the war in the East had an entirely different flavor, a different character to it than other aspects of war in the West or elsewhere in World War II.
On June 22nd, 1941, Hitler began his offensive against Russia along an 1,800-mile border. The Soviet army he faced was the largest in the world. But the purging of the military leadership in the late 1930s had seriously weakened the Red Army. And, despite Allied warnings, Stalin had failed to mobilize his forces.
The war caught the army by surprise. There was no new military equipment and supplies were lacking. There were no firm actions taken, even though Stalin and his generals knew of the situation. If our troops had been spread apart, then we would not have lost so many in the first days.
At first, the German invasion met with great success. Most of the Soviet Air Force was destroyed on the ground, but the Soviet army regrouped and then resisted. Unlike previous Nazi victims, the Soviet soldiers stood and fought. Partisan groups began to attack the Germans viciously. Peasants burned their crops to keep them from the Germans, and workers dismantled whole factories, moving them to the east.
All industry from Belarus, Ukraine, and Central Russia were evacuated to the Ural and Central Asia, and people there started to produce tanks and military equipment in open fields.
Hitler's racial policies held that all Slavic people were inferior and must be dealt with harshly. Atrocities committed by German troops created an intense hatred toward them and turned the invasion into a desperate war for national survival. The city of Smolensk, called the gateway to Moscow, fell. But the German forces had suffered heavy casualties, and an approaching Russian winter slowed the enemy advance, finally halting them 14 miles outside of Moscow.
Some industrial facilities and many people were moved out of the city, but the commanders of the Red Army and Stalin stayed in Moscow the entire time. That fact gave enormous inspiration certainly to the Red Army and to the Soviet people, knowing that the capital would be defended. The fight outside Moscow continued for 2 months. On December 5th, 1941, our army counterattacked. German artillery, tanks, and troops were destroyed, and we began to drive Hitler's armies back.
The Red Army had stopped Hitler's advance and proven that Hitler's war machine was not invincible after all. Troops now began to liberate lost territory. In the north, the ancient city of Leningrad, formerly known as St. Petersburg, was held under siege and surrounded by Finnish troops to the north and German troops to the south. The German commander demanded that the city surrender, but the Russians refused. Leningrad was bombarded night and day by aircraft and artillery. Without electricity and heat, the citizens of Leningrad still produced weapons and ammunition. Food was rationed. 8 ounces of bread apiece for troops and industrial workers, much less for others.
Mutual aid, understanding, and the solidarity of the people of Leningrad was the basis of the defense of the city. Everyone felt it was necessary to defend the city at any price. Nobody thought of surrender. But the price we paid was too high.
Out of a population of 3 million, nearly 1 million people perished. In the Far East, Japan continued to win its war against China, which had started in 1937. Japanese military force expanded across the Pacific Ocean into the Marianas, Gilbert, Marshall, and Solomon